Yes. All right. Will, we're on. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, our Grolier members and our bookish friends in the room and online. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm head of the Grolier Club Special Functions Committee, and I love this assignment because people making discoveries at the frontier of the history of the printed word and image come here to grace our podium and reveal their findings to the world. We get the great stars in the field, like tonight's stars. So, make sure to come back in 2026, sign up for our Eventbrite listings. We have great stuff coming in here, everything ranging from children's books illustrated with photography, 19th century revolutionary printing technologies, books commemorating Jewish communities lost during the Holocausts, the contributions of Black librarians to American life, and early 20th century Irish literature. Tonight we're celebrating Jane Austen's 250th birthday. It's very exciting. Happy birthday to Jane, whose writings, the popularity of whose writings has only increased with time, and the interpretations has proliferated kaleidoscopically over time. My job here tonight is simply to introduce tonight's official introducer, Mary Crawford, who will introduce our official speaker, Hilary Davidson. Mary's one of the curators of the magnificent show. We're up now on our second floor, Paper Jane, 250 Years of Austen. Mary co-curated it with Janine Barkas and Sandra Clark. Sandra is here. Janine is in Texas. All these three curators are Grolier Club members as well as life members of JASNA, the Jane Austen Society of North America. So Hilary Davidson, our other star that Mary will be introducing, her books are for sale and signing here this evening, and they're not only brilliant scholarship, they're gorgeous, and someone on your holiday list absolutely needs to know more about Regency Dress and Jane Austen and fashion. Mary Crawford would like me to note that she is no relation to the very complicated heroine of the exact same name in Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park. I could actually spend the rest of our time here this evening telling you about Mary's other accomplishments, but just briefly, she's a great bookwoman with expertise in areas including not only Jane Austen, but the underappreciated late 19th, early 20th century British writer Mary Webb, among many, many other scholarly realms. She is also a great framer of pictures and a hanger of pictures. She knows how to do upholstery, and she knows how to repair and restain damaged woodwork. She's also a massively generous philanthropist to institutions, including the Grolier Club, and the kind of person who frankly lights up rooms and makes everyone think that when she's talking to them that they're the most interesting person around. I once asked her equally brilliant and philanthropic husband, Bruce Crawford, is there anything Mary can't do? And he said, if there is, I don't know it yet. So, Mary, it's an honor to have you as a friend in this bookish community, and welcome to the podium. And I can't wait to hear what you and Hilary have to say this evening. Thank you all.
All right, so now I'm embarrassed. I'm a little bit red. But welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Grolier Club this evening. And thank you for celebrating Jane Austen's actual 250th birthday with us, the immortal Jane. The Grolier Club is very proud to have our exhibition, Paper Jane, 250 Years of Austen, open upstairs and free to the public through Valentine's Day, 2026. Dr. Hilary Davidson is a historian and curator at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, focusing on dress, textiles, and fashion during the long Regency period. She's currently chair of the Master's Studies, MA Studies in Fashion and Textile, where students learn how to research dress and fashion through the ages using primary research sources. They learn best practices for handling and storing costumes and textiles, and receive hands-on training in the conservation, storage, and display of costumes and textiles. As a researcher in the field of Regency fashion, Professor Davidson brings to life the clothing and fashion of the world depicted in Jane Austen's novels. She developed her expertise through extensive archival and object-based research while living in the Jane Austen heartland of Hampshire, England. And that's where Sandra Clark, our co-curator, had first met Hilary while she was doing primary research. Tonight, we're lucky to hear from Dr. Davidson on the historical topic for which she literally wrote the book. In fact, 3 innovative and critically acclaimed books: Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, Regency Fashion, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, and her most recent, A Guide to Regency Dress. Dr. Davidson's authoritative yet accessible publications help readers visualize the physical appearance of Austen's immortal characters, just as Austen herself illuminated their internal characters. The result is an enhanced understanding of Austen's work and time during one of Britain's most distinctive fashion and literary eras. So please help me to welcome Dr. Davidson, our keynote speaker on this, Jane Austen's 250th birthday.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you also to Sandra and Janine, the co-curators of this exhibition, and to the Grolier Club for inviting me here to give this talk on the birthday. It's very, very nice to be doing something in person after sort of building up to it all year. So I am going to talk about the words of Regency dress, which is a topic I have been very involved with in the last year in particular, and I'm going to talk about why and what I found. But I want to point out that Jane Austen wrote on clothes, figuratively and literally, because so much of the paper that forms the sort of the basis of her manuscripts, of her letters, was the final stage of the processing of clothes. If you had a lovely linen shirt, like the detail here, then once you wore it out and then you chopped it down and then you wore it out again and then you gave it to the kids and then their clothing wore out and you used it for rags and it was really, really dead, you gave it to the rag and you sold it to the rag and bone man, who eventually makes it onto paper. So I feel that there's an inherent connection there. I mean, besides the sort of the etymology of textiles and text, and I've included this picture of a layout of how you cut shirts in multiplicity, because I think it looks like book pages as well. But what I'm sort of concerned with in a bigger sense here is also, how did Jane Austen describe clothing? How did she relate that to how her contemporaries described clothing? And how did those descriptions map onto the garments and accessories people were actually wearing? And perhaps most importantly, how now can we understand the relationship between the written word and worn dress in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? So, as has been mentioned, I've spent a lot of time researching Regency dress. So this first book was a very sort of broad overview of the full spectrum of culture and society for men and women at this time. It's to use Austen's words, my own precious child in terms of my research. And then for the second book, I dived really deeply into looking at what we can know that Jane Austen wore based on her letters and surviving garments. And so this book, which, as I say in the introduction, some people may be wondering what I could possibly have more to say about Regency dress. But this is the book that is sort of closest to the interpretation of words. A Guide to Regency Dress is more like a kind of a dictionary or a glossary, and it is literally about defining words for people who are interested in researching them. So it runs through the chapters of women, men, hair and beauty, jewelry, textiles and trimmings. But my favourite description of it is from a friend who, when I showed it to her and that it's the smaller size, she went, "Oh, it looks like a field guide to the drawing room." So I feel now that this is where you can look up kind of the lesser spotted muslin and the common or garden breeches and, identify them in the wild. But I'm also, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from here. And I now speak 3 different kinds of English, Australian, British and American. And let me tell you, what the words of clothing means can be very different in each of those 3 cultures. So I'm very interested in how we have this relationship between the word on the page or the word in speech and what it actually means in a garment, because A man in vest, pants and suspenders is very different things in each of those three countries, in varying combinations. So how then can we also kind of like, if we have shifting and slippery definitions of words now, how much harder is it to sort of go back and look at how people understood them in the past? And one of the very first academic papers I gave on Austen, a good decade ago now, was actually looking at how she disseminated fashion through her letters in this written form. Because clothing is, one of the reasons I'm interested in it, is clothing, it's an essential part of human culture. And whether explicitly acknowledged or not, was something that everybody in the Regency world experienced on or through their bodies as they observed, handled, bought and made fashion. And much of the knowledge of new styles was created and shared through words rather than images. So this is Austen to Cassandra thanking her for a number of clothes that she's bought, that Cassandra has bought Austen by proxy in London. So looking at the complexities of fashion through words, the medium in which Austen excelled, helps us close the gap between what we can now read about fashion and how those words connected with the clothes these historical people wore. What it would do if I change the slide. There we are. So this is actually the wonderful, wonderful account book of Mrs. Mary Topham, which I found in Chawton House Library, which is where I first met Sandra Clark. And it's the account book of a lady between 1810 and 1823, and I worked out who it was through internal evidence. But she's writing down all of her daily purchases of small bits of fashion amidst her lavender water and walking shoes and ribbons for a bag and muslins. And, how do I translate these kind of broad account entries into the bigger picture? What did she mean when she wrote this? And so for this book, excuse me one second. For this book, which I was kind of meaning to be, the Guide to Regency Dress, I wanted to be a very accessible source that anyone could pick up and kind of start to look things up and understand what they meant. But then I realised as I did it, to be fair, when I first started, I thought, no, I can just, I've got all the information, I'll just put it in a different form. I went down rabbit holes. You're going to see some of the rabbit holes today. But sources like this, which is Barbara Johnson's albums, that she kept throughout her lifetime between 1746 and 1823. These are the kind of sources that you need because they combine image, text and fabric. So that her annotations here at the bottom, and the middle, she's got a black twilled sarcenet, 8 shillings a yard, mourning for Mr. Woodhall, November 1816. That's fantastic because it tells us what this thing is and what they thought the word for this thing was. And so people wrote to each other as well, sharing all these details of cut, construction and textiles for clothing that they already had or were planning to acquire. And Jane and Cassandra Austen's letters are full of these details kind of incidentally in the 161 letters that survive. And they're kind of a glimpse into the realities of clothing for Austen and show her informal, spontaneous uses of fashion and textile language. And it's from these letters that I really drew most of the second book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, pulling out these, it's sometimes just a word or two, and explaining what they might have meant for people at the time. By contrast, in Austen's formal, highly considered fiction writing, clothing is actually rarely described. And when it is, it tells us something, the reader something of character or contributes to the plot. And the way that Austen does this are often elements of her literary genius. So something as small as a handbag speaks volumes under Austen's pen. In Emma, a purple and gold ridicule, it's a fashionable item, but it's also gaudy, vulgar and too loud, summarising the personality of Augusta Elton to whom it belongs. And Austen didn't need to choose any of these words, but she did. And the fact that she did tells us that, it tells us something because she never ever wastes words. And when we look further, Austen rarely has a positive word to say about the colour purple in fiction or in her letters. And she's playing on the kind of the ridicule of the owner implicit in the object. But this kind of emphasis on text is something that I've had to slightly fight for a little bit, because we are now a much more visual people. And when we look at some of the great sources of fashion information in this period, which are fashion plates, we emphasize the plates over the accompanying text, and they really require this textual accompaniment to understand what's going on here. And I think more of the images as being an accessory, an accompaniment to the text, rather than vice versa, because the readers needed to understand their material qualities. And also what's depicted is not always what is written, so there's discrepancies between it. But to give you an idea of the kind of work that I was doing, imagine that this one on the left actually has highlights on the textile and fashion words as well. These are the words that I was looking at. This is the description of the two dresses in the picture before. So what is a round train gain? What is clear muslin, a diadem, a puffed sleeve? And how could I explain this to others? When Austen uses handkerchief, what does she mean by that? And I'm going to show you why that's confusing in a second. And so descriptions of dress from Austen or anyone else really need to be understood as a form of kind of shorthand reference to common current understandings. And I found myself having to go back to first principles quite a lot. So just to give you a look at how I've organised this, it is like this dictionary or glossary format. I've got an introduction to each chapter, but then I have the form of headword and variant spellings, and then the definitions as best as I could define them. And what I also really tried to do in this book was keep this to the late 18th and early 19th century, because words meant something different before sometimes, and these words might shift later. So to sort of look at this kind of detail, the possible meanings of words, and in a kind of quite Austenian gesture, to be alert to the detail and the nuance of language. But I also tried to put into words things that I had only understood by looking at a lot of material objects, like how the cut and construction of clothing changes and how you can detail this. To be honest, I had this in my first book, but it was right at the back and nobody looked at it. So I just made it prettier and moved it up the front, and I hope this will be more useful. But again, I'm trying to sort of transmit my embodied knowledge in a written form, and we'll see how successful that is. So I want to go through some of the other kind of themes and trends and difficulties about associating words and fashion that I've really kind of emphasized in the book. And one of them is the fact that the phrase empire line it's completely anachronistic. It's the way that we describe this high-waisted dress of the period now, but it doesn't really come in until about 1907. When Paul Poiret is doing a lot of empire or directoire-inspired dresses. So you can see his Josephine in 1907, and then more of these high-waisted dresses in 1908. So 100 years later, you can look back and say, oh, yes, this is the style of the French Empire. But if we think about it in the time period, there is no name for this. It's just, a high waist, a low waist. Why would the British call something after the French Empire? Especially since Napoleon doesn't become emperor until 1804. So this is, if this is your takeaway, it wasn't ever called the Empire Line then. My work here is done. That's great. But I also really kind of noticed a Frenchification of language in a new way, because I kind of knew vaguely that there is a real shift in fashion after 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. What I always like to think of is Napoleon Part 2, The Revenge. You think you find in 1814, and then like the shark Napoleon comes back to life, but he's finally defeated in 1815. Anyhow, that there's a lot of words for fashionable items that, as dress historians and in costuming communities, we use now sort of to commonly refer to things. So a chemise for the smock or the shift, the linen garment that you put next to your skin. But when I was really starting to look at the meaning of words, I realised that a lot of this Frenchification doesn't happen until after 1815. And now we tend to talk about this pre-1815 period in more French terms, when there are actually kind of historic shifts in the way that this language gets used. And to give you kind of illustrations of the difficulty of even the solid English words that we have, such as handkerchief, I assure you that everything on this page is a handkerchief in some form or another. Starting from the top left, we have the pocket handkerchief that Jane Austen embroidered for her sister Cassandra. Austen was an excellent seamstress, by the way. I cannot do satin stitch like she could do satin stitch. Down below it, we have a collared neck handkerchief. In the middle, we've got a lovely silk handkerchief. At the top, when the purple, both of the sort of the purple scarf-like things are described as handkerchiefs in the accompanying text. And then at the bottom, this fine gentleman is Jem Belcher, boxing champion of all England, 4 years, 1801, 1805, wearing the handkerchief that took his name, a belcher, which is also a neck handkerchief. But in this sort of spirit of what it wasn't called, this is never called a fichu in English period sources, although this is one of these kind of words that we use in summary quite a lot. And something else that I noticed when quite at the end of the research for the book, and I suddenly went, oh no, do I have to rewrite everything I know, was I was looking at this type of thing. And this type of thing is a linen or cotton garment that fills in the neckline of a woman's gown or acts like a kind of shirt that goes underneath a riding habit. So this has all sorts of names that associate with different forms. This is my best guessed one. So you have a tucker, which is something that tucks into the neckline. The very common habit shirt, which is worn with riding habits and looks like men's shirts. So it could have sleeves, no sleeves, but it's giving the impression of being cut exactly like men's shirts. All sorts of variations of these collared neck handkerchiefs and things that are called shirt handkerchiefs. So this is, you can start to see why like the word handkerchief itself is like, well, what do we actually mean by handkerchief? But also, I should say that where I've got an asterisk, the image that I've used is not in the book. So if it doesn't have that, this is all in the new book. But the one thing that I did not find a reference to is the word that we commonly use to refer to this garment, which is a chemisette. So once I realised that quite late in the process, having confidently said that these things are chemisettes, I started going, okay, well, what is a chemisette in this period? So once I did keyword searches for this, and I was looking just in fashion plates to begin with, I came up with, this is a chemisette front, this is a chemisette form, a chemisette sleeve, and a chemisette waist. So now I kind of want to write a whole article just on what a chemisette is, because I got into French dictionary sources. It seems to kind of come from a kind of waistcoat. I've got all sorts of theories now, but are these chemisettes? And I don't know. So even something as simple as, you look in any catalogue for dress, we know it's a chemisette. Maybe none of them are chemisettes. So, yeah, making life difficult for myself. And another word that's got a lot of kind of different meanings to it is petticoat. I had the most fabulous copy editor for the first book, and by the time we got to the glossary entry for petticoat, she was terribly polite and terribly English, and even she was going, Hilary, all of these things, you're calling them all a petticoat. And I had to write back and go, it's not my fault, it's the Regency people. They called all of these things petticoat. I'm not, doing this to vex you. So again, here are multiplicities of from left to right, a petticoat that is made out of white cotton that goes under your gown but does have a bodice to it. Then we have the lovely Dr. Flannel in a caricature who is handing a lady a flannel petticoat to keep her loins warm, and she's assuring him she has no loins. Then we've got a petticoat that looks like the cotton petticoat in the first one, but it's actually used as an outer gown, an outer piece, and it hooks onto the bottom of the spencer that it's worn with to sort of create a dress that is the illusion of a jacket and dress. But wait, there's more. All of these things are petticoats as well. So you have a printed outer gown with a matching petticoat underneath it that is meant to be seen. And this is kind of what we need to be thinking of perhaps with Elizabeth Bennet's The Gown Raised and the Petticoat 6 inches deep in mud. And then what these ladies are wearing, that's kind of an outer gown with a sleeveless top, is also called a petticoat. And then at the end, the highest form of formal dress, court dress, that purple skirt underneath the drapery is also a petticoat. And I think I'll give some kind of prize to the first costume designer who is willing to put the reality of Regency court dress on screen, because there was requirements to wear petticoat hoops with it, which come from the 18th century. And as the waist rose, that requirement did not disappear. And so you have all these court ladies kind of resting their elbows on their waistline. And it's not until the Prince Regent becomes George IV in 1820 that this requirement goes and they start to look normal. But I think it's a fantastically silly style, and I really want to see it on screen. And then sort of look at other kind of foundational items or words that we think we know what they mean. And corset is a fantastic example of this. So we often, if you say corset now, we think of something like that garment in the middle, that it runs from sort of shoulder or bust to hip. It supports the torso and especially gives support to the breasts. And it comes in sort of varying forms. But the word corset itself, which is another sort of French import, it comes from a little body, from corps for body. And so we also have things like this charming little kind of bolero top that would have been called a corset at the time. And I've included a bit of text there as well. For full dress, the corset frock in coloured crepe, Italian net or coloured lino, you can find out what all of these things are in the book at the back, is extremely elegant. But then we also have kind of modern cataloguing, which, as someone who's worked as a curator for many years, I'm really interested in, what do we call things now? And this piece at the end is on the Met's website as a corset, although it has no centre busk and it has no boning and it's laced very tightly. However, I don't think it's a corset, I think it's a waistcoat, which is the form of kind of soft, warm underwear which men and women are wearing underneath their clothing, as well as also being the word for this kind of, the male sleeveless garment underneath. And I think this is actually laced far too tightly and would have had a stomacher piece in it. And it's actually kind of soft, casual homeware. And just to confuse things even further, this is also a waistcoat, but this is for men. And this is a flannel waistcoat of the kind that Marianne Dashwood is so disparaging of in Sense and Sensibility, where she's 17 and she's just met the 35-year-old, ancient Colonel Brandon, who I don't think it's spoilers to say that she's going to marry. And she complains that he talks of flannel waistcoat, and for her this conjures every form of kind of rheumatism and ills. But as you might guess from this flannel waistcoat that only has one sleeve, this was the waistcoat of Admiral Lord Nelson, who lost an arm in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1798. And actually flannel waistcoats they were worn in huge amounts by people in the Navy and in the Army, and they kept them warm. They were considered kind of almost a tool of war. So Austen, again, is playing with these kind of dual meanings of flannel waistcoat for illness, but also for kind of military prowess. And I'm very happy to stand up here and say I cannot actually define what a bonnet is in this period. I'm okay with that, but these are all examples of bonnets. If the text is in quotes, I've got that from a fashion plate, and we kind of have this image of perhaps like the French bonnet up the top there, the thing with the brim on it. This is one of the kind of iconic items of Regency dress, and you often hear costume designers for period drama saying, oh, we're not going to put the actresses into bonnets because it's going to shade their face. Well, not if it's a black velvet bonnet hat. Bonnets don't have to have brims to them, like you think of a Scotch bonnet or a tam o' shanter now. So there's all of this kind of variation and play in the words of fashion and how they describe them. And personally, I think a lot of these might have just been someone who's writing the text going, yeah, I think I'm going to call it that. And now as a historian, I'm like, yes, they all called this thing. Cloaks as well were a bit of a surprise. We think, again, of a cloak. Kind of the classic example is this lovely red example in the front, in the left, which is a portrait of John Constable's sisters. I've used a lot of Constable's portraits in this book. He was really wonderful at recording dress details. But a lot of the time when they refer to a cloak, they mean that lovely pink garment, which I've used a fashion plate that shows you both the front and the back, and it's more like a kind of a scarf, which is sometimes described as a scarf cloak. And then we also have the fantastic Spencer cloak, which is that short jacket, but with a cloak front at the beginning. And I feel this just kind of, it opens up a whole different world of possibilities for costuming and for fashionable play, but you might not associate these words with these images without kind of closely reading the text. And so I do look at men's dress as well, which is something that doesn't get as much love as women's dress in this period. And one of the best resources for men's clothing details to really understand them is the proliferation of tailors' manuals that start coming out at this time, really starting with the Tailor's Complete Guide in about 1796. And so this image is taken from, I think, the 1817 version of Golding's Tailor's Assistant. And it actually, the annotations are mine, but the text comes from him, this lovely kind of a graphic of this is what you call this bit. And as tailors who, again, have this embodied knowledge, started to print their understanding and their expertise, we can come back and say, I've done a lot of identification of specific types of coats, for examples, by reading through the tailor telling me why this detail made it an X kind of coat. And we can see that contrast between how clothing is worn, like this gorgeous 1816 picture of Lord Grantham by Anger, and then the kind of the diagrams of how the tailors might have thought of putting these together. And again, kind of one of the joys of historical research is discovery. So this kind of detail at the collar of a coat, which again you can see in Lord Grantham, although the line goes perfectly through it, we tend to call this as dress historians the M notch, but I found one description of it in a fashion plate as a heart shape, which just it kind of changes the way that you look at it, and I think it's lovely. So these kind of details of men's dress, the image at the end is my illustration of a hunting coat. And again, the association with those words might be of the kind of the classic hunting reds or pinks as they're now called. But it turns out, thanks to the tailor's manuals, that a hunting coat is a very particular kind of cut where it's cut through the body and it nearly closes at the front and it's single-breasted. The whole chapter goes into the details of this. But now looking at this, I can associate the word with the picture, and also a chance to kind of pull out things like flannel drawers, which don't get seen that much, but they're often written about, but they don't make it into kind of fashionable expressions of dress. And this caricature, which shows quite explicitly the difference between a pair of Hessians, which is the one with the pointy top and the tassel, and a jockey or a top boot, while also being a political satire of the day. The greatcoat, again, this is a phrase that I took for granted. A greatcoat sort of means an outer coat, but I really started to understand that it does mean great as in outer, and in that wonderful kind of English usage of, you know, St. James the Great and St. James the Lesser. And all of these kind of driving coats, box coats, surtouts, redingotes, you can see that kind of influence there. Although redingote is the most fantastic triple meaning because it comes from riding coat being pronounced in French as redingote and then being translated back into coming back into English as redingote. So you can see how those words shift. And this is a wonderful picture of lots of different kinds of great coats at this point. But one of the kind of new things that I found was that A spencer is also a greatcoat. And again, the spencer is this sort of short, high-waisted garment we usually associate with women. It was a man's garment first. And I've deviated from my usual sticking strictly to British sources by pulling in this picture from a painting, a sketch for a painting by Boyer in 1808, where you can see this kind of short coat worn over a long coat. But this text, again, the text that I found for it that says that spencers are short greatcoats, it tells us why. The spencer in dry but cold weather is preferable to the greatcoat, which has sort of long skirts to it, being much less fatiguing and equally comfortable, because the greatcoats weigh a lot. They can be up to sort of 10 pounds of fabric. And so if it's not actually raining, all you need is a spencer to keep you warm. So these kind of combinations can illuminate how and why people are wearing things. And to move to the kind of the more commonly understood women's spencer, again, now we tend to call anything that has a high waist and is a jacket a spencer. But the word jacket is equally used in texts of the time. I've seen a few things online recently about people talking about loving sleeveless spencers, and with my new kind of found knowledge, I'm like, there's actually no such thing as a sleeveless spencer. It's probably a corset. But, you know, I'm interested in, like, sometimes it's a jacket, sometimes it's a spencer, and there doesn't necessarily seem to be a rhyme or reason why. And then lots of these more common words can move between multifunctions, move between genders in all sorts of ways that, again, makes pulling out their meaning quite complicated. So a nightgown can be a thing that a woman sleeps in. It can be a thing that a man sleeps in, but also called a nightshirt. A nightgown can also be called a morning gown for men, or a banyan or a powdering robe or a dressing gown. But then women can have bed gowns, which are not for sleeping in. They're never for sleeping in. Is that clear? It's kind of like a short, comfortable jacket, and you can just about see underneath that she's wearing this kind of waistcoat or jumps with a stomacher and the lacing over the top. And with your thing that can be a multiplicity of nightgowns, you can have a nightcap, which for women is only ever what you wear for sleeping. Oopsie daisies. So for women, it's only ever what you wear for sleeping. For men, it can be something sort of soft and warm that keeps you warm in bed or at night. It can be worn informally with the nightgown or the morning gown, or even just like this picture of the tailor at the end. He's in his formal clothing, but he's in his shop and not wearing a hat. So he's just got a kind of informal nightcap on to accompany it. And jewellery is another area that I've sort of not really looked at in such detail before, and I really enjoyed pulling out the details of this. So this is the English actress Sarah Siddons in a fantastic Cornelian ensuite set or parure, and looking at the meanings of things like canatee, which is a kind of filigree detail there. But I was also interested in kind of looking at the functions of jewellery and how they were actually working. This redoubtable matron, who I just adore, she's one of my favourite sort of finds for this book. She's showing how miniatures, which we look at for their artistic value, for their transactional value, for details of clothing, but she's showing how it was worn, that they're actually a piece of jewellery. And then the lady on the side is showing the way that the brooch is pinned, how she's wearing a corset underneath because of the strain of the clothing. But all of this dress that people are wearing really relied on the textiles that went into it. And the textiles were kind of at least half of the fashion that was part of dress. And again, one of the iconic fabric of the period is muslin. And the muslin dress is prevalent everywhere. So I think by now you're not going to be surprised to hear me say, but what kind of muslin? And one of the things that I was really pleased to find was, this list of the weights of cotton fabrics, because in fashion plates you often see, oh, this is a cambric or jaconet morning dress, or it is just a cambric dress or just a jaconet dress. And this is actually from heaviest to lightest, the hierarchy of these white cotton fabrics. And it highlights as well the importance of looking at the text that goes with it, because we might just see a white dress in a fashion plate. And all of these had different material qualities. They meant something to Regency consumers. How could you wash them? What do you have to do to take care of them? How long are they going to last? What sort of level of formality are they appropriate for? This haptic understanding was really, really important. And to just go just into muslin alone, these are kind of different types of muslin, overall that we can the found. Jamdani and Chikan are original Indian names for the qualities, but we can go into even more detail of the descriptions, not just the types, but the descriptions. So checked, clear, which means something that's more transparent, coloured muslin, which could be printed or dyed, figured, which is a word that often just means a thing that has a pattern in it, not necessarily only applied to muslin, flowered, printed, sprigged, spotted, which is a sort of direct translation or description of the doruka technique. Stained, which doesn't mean you've got it dirty, it just means that it's dyed. Striped, worked, which just means it's embroidered. And then my favourite, silver muslin and gilt muslin, which are the ones that are illustrated here, really kind of playing on the possible contrast between shiny, metallic, lustrous fabric, metals, and then the kind of the dull, delicate base of the muslin underneath. And one of the interesting things that I spent a lot of time hunting down was a type of muslin that didn't make sense to me, because Japan muslin or japanned muslin appears a lot, and no textile history book could tell me what this was. And the fact that it was there as a description, that it is something has been done to it to Japan it, suggested this is a technique. And thanks to a sample of a textile of a Japan Batilla muslin in the Repository of Arts, I think my suggestion is that this is another of these kind of corruptions of words, and that it actually refers to the Jamdani technique, because Japan is not producing muslin at this time. And when you look at where all of kind of the possibilities of muslin, Jamdani, Japan, I feel is a plausible elision. And this, so I think japanned muslin is this kind of muslin that's got deliberate patterns woven into it with a separate thread. And there's lots of examples of this in museum collections. We've just never known what to call it. And it has descriptions that we've kind of made up, but I think this is what Japan muslin is. And then all of the kind of nets as well. We see lots of references to point lace, patent net, double point lace. What did this mean? And hidden in these words is actually a huge relationship to industrializing technology for textile weaving throughout what is going to become the Industrial Revolution. Britain is trying to compete with India for making muslins, but there is a decades-long race on to be the first person to accurately replicate a twisted hexagonal net ground of the kind that you see in handmade lace. How can we get to make the machine-made be handmade in this? And so we have these points of breakthrough, and if you look really carefully at that kind of peach coloured, you can see that it's sort of got a double thread on it. This is point lace or patent lace, so called because a patent was taken out for it. But if you imagine it as being loops, like if you cut a sweater, you can just pull that one line of thread out. That's exactly what was happening there. And so the person who broke through and finally made net that imitated bobbin lace, it doesn't happen till 1809. It's John Heathcote, although he builds on a lot of other people's work. And then we have bobbinet, which has various variations there. We perhaps are more familiar with it as tulle today, because those rascally French were very keen to get their hands on this technology. It gets smuggled out of Britain, and the town of Tulle in France is one of the major producing areas for this fabric. So even in just the kind of what is a net called, you can tie this into huge geopolitical and industrial developments. So things, even descriptions of fabric that was quite sort of common, printed calico. Now, even like talking about muslins and calicos, this is something where I have to translate between Englishes because we've got different understandings of this. In calico, this is a sample book from the late 18th century of printed cottons, and that kind of coloured printed cotton is still the meaning of calico in the US, whereas calico in kind of Commonwealth English means what is called muslin in the US. So it's the kind of plain fabric that you make toiles out of. And so those differences between language then, language now is I still have to translate these. And things, sometimes this can diverge completely. So if I say poplin fabric now, it's basically a shirting fabric. It's generally made out of cotton or a cotton polyester blend. It's lightweight, it's crisp, it is for shirts and equivalents. But in Austen's day, it was a silk wool blend, and you could wear it for the evening. So Mrs. Augusta Elton has a lovely silver and white poplin for her dinner dress. But just to kind of finish up, I make everybody listen to this because it's my favourite discovery of the whole book. And it does actually tie back to Austen, which is defining what a sarcenet is. And this is important to me because the detail that you can see here is of Jane Austen's pelisse, the only known body garment that has the association of belonging to Austen, and one that I've done a huge amount of research on. It's the reason I work on Regency Dress, was being asked to reconstruct this. My reconstruction of this was in the Morgan Library exhibition, A Lively Mind. So I started with this, and I've never known exactly what a sarcenet was. What makes it a sarcenet? It's definitely a kind of silk, but it comes in all colours, all weaves. And again, no textile history book could give me a technical definition. And I finally found that it's a silk that's woven with soft or degummed silk. And a taffeta is one that's woven with hard silk that still has the Saracen coating on it. So this is something that just makes me happy after 18 years of research, but I share it with you all so you can, delight with me. So that is the kind of the end of my talk, and sort of a quick run through of the joys, delights, challenges of just associating words and dress in this period, in this medium that was so important to Jane Austen, that is the way that we encounter her now, and kind of giving people a way, I hope, to take those words and have, in the same way that we populate her world, her characters, with that vision, that we can kind of use that to enhance the way that we read Austen. Thank you. So I know we're running slightly late because of the technical difficulties. I'm very happy to take questions, but if you do have to run away, I won't take it personally. And we have a microphone for questions if anybody has any.
This is glorious, and I love how honest you are about the mysteries that have eluded you after all these years. Thank you, Hilary. This was fantastic. So could a striving, upwardly mobile woman walk into a party in Jane Austen's time in a gown that was maybe made with a 2-year-old? Could you recycle something and look rich? That's my question.
If you did it well, if you retrimmed it, I think that would be the important thing, that you retrim it according to specifically what is in fashion now, and if the fabric wasn't too worn out, because this is one of the problems with muslin. It's very delicate. So if you, there's quite a few complaints in period sources about dancing with a gentleman in boots who has spurs on his boots that rip up the bottom of your gown. So muslins could get shabby quite easily. So maybe you want to invest in a white satin that you can dye if you need to. So if you're a kind of clever managing sort of person like the Mrs. Steele in Sense and Sensibility, who when they're with Lady Middleton, they're copying the pattern of one of her new London dresses, then yeah, you you could make it work. You just have to kind of pay attention to all of the details and make sure that it's au courant with what's happening in fashion.
Hi, this was such a lovely talk. Thank you so much. At the beginning of the talk, you talked about the purple handbag and how that had like a special. It was meant to convey a special meaning specifically from Austen. Were there any clothes or pieces of clothing or drapery or something that you found was conveying like almost a secret message to the people of the time that sort of surprised you that modern audiences might not know?
So for me, I think the best example of this is Colonel Brandon's flannel waistcoat, because flannel was used when you were sick and you were ill. So Marianne is absolutely right at reading it at this first level. She's seeing an old man and associating it with illness and incapacity, and it's a sign of her misreading. It's kind of her sensibility, not her sense. People at the time would have known that it had a military association. So she's seeing age and she's missing heroism, because Colonel Brandon was an active soldier. He was in India, and people would have known about this association, not least because there was a huge flannel drive in 1793 that had lots of women sort of making things to send to the continent. So there's connections with that. However, there's a third meaning as well, which is, pure Austen to get all of this into one association, which is in Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son. He refers to the saying that that an old man should just put on a flannel waistcoat instead of taking a young wife to his bosom. So and this is like Lord Chesterfield's letters are very popular, multiple of editions. So she's saying Marianne misreads this. Colonel Brandon is a hero and can still make fun of the age difference and that kind of playing with it all in one go. And I didn't know this for like 5 years of researching, and it's just it's Austen. She just slips it in there, and you can catch it if you like, but it's completely lost on us now. So yeah, for me, that's just one of those hats off to Jane Austen moments. Other questions?
Does anyone ever dare mention pregnancy in the fashion journals or in the novels, or is that so taboo? Does anyone ever say this would be comfortable should you ever be, trailing off?
No, I mean the nearest, as far as I remember off the top of my head, the nearest Austen comes to mentioning it is Miss Bates in Emma says of the new Mrs. Weston, I hope she doesn't have a headache. And actually what she's referring to is miscarriage. But when you look at the dates in Emma and when Mrs. Weston has her baby, and look back at the ball scene, you realise that she's like 7 to 8 months pregnant. And Mr. Elton snubbing Harriet in order to ask an 8-month pregnant woman to dance it magnifies the incredible social gaffe, because she should be resting. She's not dancing, and he jumps over the eligible woman to someone who is clearly pregnant, and she just leaves it there for you to add up. However, if people do want to know more about what people are actually recommended to wear for pregnancy, there's 2 doctors, Sinclair and also Buchan, who are very opinionated about what women should and shouldn't wear in pregnancy. And basically it's, don't bind, babies come out deformed if you wear your stays too tight, be relaxed, be comfortable. And so we see it addressed quite clearly in the medical literature, more than certainly not directly in Austen in her fiction.
Thank you. You did mention the purple that Mrs. Elton's bag, or Mr. Elton's bag. What is your observation and interpretation of colors, the meaning of any colors or color appropriate before boys wore blue and women wore pink?
It's not so much of a factor in this period. It's more about kind of convention for maybe times of day or ages of people. Older women were kind of sort of expected to wear kind of darker, less bright colours. But when you look at their account books, like Mrs. Topham's, they're ignoring that completely, or at least Mrs. Topham is. She's buying herself muslin dresses and amber and green. And so again, that difference between what society said you should do and how people actually negotiate that in their bodies and individual experience is always just a fascinating kind of tension. And that's kind of what we get in the difference between that incredibly polished formality of Austen's fiction and the kind of looserness of the letters. And even in like the way that she talks about clothing. Northanger Abbey, her kind of earliest novel, is the clothesiest of the novels. And I think that if she'd had a chance to like really revise it before publication, we would have lost a lot of the clothing detail. It's like she just would have erased it and pulled it away, which is kind of a sidetrack. But I've not found anything that's really kind of specific so much about colours having meanings. There's a lot of advice about, much like the sort of colour seasons now, you should dress to suit your complexion. And it's very like blondes should wear blue and, brunettes should wear red and, redheads should never wear green. Like, it's really kind of basic advice, but there's a little bit of that going on as well, all couched in the, you must set off your beauty appropriately language.
Manufacturing different textiles. You see things that were like madras blue, like the tints, the colors, and the textures, because muslin does take color very well.
Very, very well. So all colours are available through all sorts of mechanisms. Dyeing is not an exact science at the time. It's kind of messing around with chemistry before they even call it chemistry. And there is one in her letters, poor Jane Austen has a moment where that she sent a dress to be dyed blue and it fell apart at a touch. And there was 4 shillings wasted because the dyer clearly hasn't used a dye that, well, he's used perhaps something that's too harsh. So I talk about that a little bit more in the second book. Yeah.
I'd like to know, I don't know if it's just more from the movies or from the actual thing, but with the difference with bonnets and then all the turbans, and how did the turbans come out? Because they're so dramatic and kind of over the top.
So turbans emerged from a kind of a strong Orientalist trend in fashion that had been building from the mid-18th century. And as kind of hair gets looser and wilder and softer in the 1790s, you see a lot of kind of scarves wrapped around as turbans and becoming a little bit more structured as hats. And so as turbans become like one of the options of hats, like the Mameluke cap that Jane Austen wore to a party in, I think, 1799 or 1800, they could be sort of loose things that you bits of fabric that you pinned, but more often they're kind of structured like hats. So they look like a turban, they're structured like hats, but they seem to have been particularly favoured by older women and intellectual or artistic women. There's a slight trend towards that. So Madame de Staël, she always wore a turban as part of her kind of literary affect. But they were certainly a very common alternative to caps, bonnets, especially for evening wear. So you could wear a kind of dramatic, fabulous hat. And I think too, and you see a lot of references to this, that they also cover up a lot of the hair. So if perhaps your hair was greying and you weren't so comfortable with that, you could put all your hair up under a turban and then add a false fringe that was, curled. And I've seen references to women, you cut off like the end of your own hair and have it made into a fringe, or your daughter's. So I leave that out there. She's still got the colour you had, just like take a bit off the end. And then you can have a little front or a fringe that they might add to the turban. So if you ever look at a picture of a woman in a turban, just check out if it matches her eyebrows, because sometimes you can see if there's false hair going on underneath there. And it does seem to be particularly associated with turbans because that's the only bit that you see.
Just curious about buttons. You see that the men's vests have buttons, And in this period, like I was just in your presentation, were women's clothes, did they use buttons? You don't seem to see them.
Not that often. So the sort of the forefront often buttons up to the side, but the button back, it doesn't really appear till about 1804. And in fact, the picture of Jane Austen from behind by her sister with the buttons down the back, that's one of the earliest datable examples of buttons down the back. But even then, once they come in, they're not necessarily doing a lot of the fastening work, if you see what I mean. Like everyone can imagine when you button something and then it strains slightly. So sometimes what you see is fake buttons on the top and then hooks and eyes underneath that are actually holding it together. But it is more tapes, pins, ties, and it gets sort of more buttons into the 1810s, and then as the century progresses, we get more buttons. But they tend to prefer things that actually allow for a bit more malleability. And relationship to that pregnancy question, these are often gowns that you can adjust the drawstring of, you can adjust the waist of, and that does make it easier for a changing body. Do we have time for one more question, if there is one?
Are you and Mary and Sandra horrified at what people wear to Jane Austen Society conferences?
I reserve judgment because that's not the point. Like if everyone was there to do like the most super accurate, historically accurate clothing they could, that would be one thing. But people are there to express themselves or dress up or feel a certain way. And that's an entirely valid reason to dress up. Nobody needs the fashion police coming along and going, even though you didn't intend to do this, you haven't got this right. Like, that's just not fun. So I reserve all judgment, and I'm really glad that people feel comfortable enough to dress up at events like that. Honestly, like that's what I think is not important. It's how people feel.
You don't come around and say that is not a sunset.
I did speak to someone at the last Jane Austen festival, and she was like, I'm a part of a group that we're really into the costuming, and we would actually, we'd like your feedback on things. So I sort of very delicately said, would you like critique? Because, I could maybe do a workshop where people who wanted this and who volunteered for this could come and ask questions, and I could say, well, maybe you could do this a bit more like this and that more a bit like this. She went, yes, we would love that. I'm like, okay. All right. I'm not sure they might like it afterwards, but if that is something that people that would help them and that they would choose to do, I'd be very, very happy to help that. But yeah, I'm certainly not going to just swoop upon people like some descending force of meanness and say, I don't like your bonnet. It's no, it would not be kind, and it's not the point. So yeah. And actually, I love seeing what people come up with as well. Like, it's really nice being like, I know that fashion plate, and someone's, done it beautifully. It can be really exciting. And to get to see all this clothing on different kinds of bodies, on real people, kind of away from that fashion plate imaginary is really nice. So, yeah. So I think we will stop there. Yes, so I will sign books. There are Jane Austen's Wardrobe and a Guide to Regency Book of Dress, a Guide to Regency Books, that's what the Grolier Club's for, is available down the end, and I will be signing. So thank you so much online and in the room for listening.